Now, I'd like to turn for a second to the internal domestic politics
Okay.
of Ukraine. Because there were some verbal fisticuffs between Zelensky and the mayor of Kyiv, Klitschko, trading blame for the energy situation or the lack of energy. And Zelensky has also brought in Budanov into his cabinet, former head of military intelligence. What do you make of all this? Is Zelensky more firmly in the saddle now, or divisions emerging? We have the prospects of potential elections. General Zelensky is in London, so there are all these different...
Okay, a lot to choose from there. I'll start with Klitschko. So this is not new. President Zelensky and Mayor Klitschko have long had tensions. Both are, strong leaders, strong-willed, and have a lot that they're dealing with. They've had spats before. Right now, this is focused on the energy crisis in Kyiv. Of course, the ultimate blame is on the Russians, but there are questions on, the level of preparedness, the responsiveness, and the situation is quite rough in Kyiv. And I think that does require looking at local leadership. That said, President Zelensky's control and in the saddle overall, I don't think that's ever been in doubt. He made some smart changes recently in the government. It was time for some personnel moves, and you mentioned Budanov. Budanov is well respected. He did amazing things in his last position. He's smart. I think it's good that he's getting involved in the negotiations. He certainly understands the Russians, and I think and I hope that there's respect on the American side for all that he does. I think they're restructuring a bit how the positions worked. But the chief of staff to President Zelensky is powerful, is important. And right now, I think the key focus is these diplomatic talks, U.S. engagement. As for elections, that's been being speculated about in Ukraine for years at this point. What I hear primarily still from opposition and civil society is that, of course, we want elections at some point. We're a democracy. We feel very strong. People are kind of getting ready, but they don't want them yet, because they don't think it can be, safe yet, fair yet. And so they say, we are thinking on it, we're looking, but we're in dual realities. On one hand, it could happen anytime. On the other hand, we don't see an end to the war coming. So, they'll continue looking at different options. You mentioned a couple named, but Ukraine always has surprises, so there could be others. But I don't see it happening in the immediate term. But if it does come sooner rather than later, plans are already in place in various areas.
Now, another thing that has not occurred is there's been no Russian breakthrough on the front lines. That's quite telling, isn't it? That this war, that the Ukrainians are actually, given their resources, doing extremely well.
I'm glad you mentioned that. It relates to when we were talking about the Russian economy's weakness as well. Russia loves to portray themselves as this great power, this great strength that, it's undeniable that they will conquer. Well, their special military operation was supposed to take, 3 days? Didn't happen. Zelensky's still in power. The government hasn't been toppled. They haven't taken the areas they said they're going to take. But they're demanding, territorial concessions and negotiations for areas they militarily have not been able to take. So this great power is losing huge amounts of people, putting tons of resources into it, and Ukraine is still pushing them back. But people sometimes are misled to think that Russia is winning on the battlefield, and they're not. Ukraine isn't massively beating them back. I'm not going to say that. But, Russia is not doing so well.
The point I think is what I gleaned during my recent trip was that the Ukrainians have an incredible advantage in the sense that one drone operator can take out 200 Russian soldiers. I mean, it seems to me that a stalemate is in many ways a win for the Ukrainians, because the Russians cannot conduct this war in perpetuity.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And there's a lot to that. The Ukrainians, of course, have less people, but they also put more care on their people because of their, values, but also they need those people for their society. That's not the Russian ethos for various reasons as well. Ukrainians are very savvy. They're doing massive damage with cheap drones. And so they can keep that up to a certain extent. Russians are also using the drones, and that can be brutal. But we're seeing these evolve, and it is a bit of a stalemate to a certain extent. But we also see sometimes Ukrainians inch forward and take areas. Sometimes the Russians do a little bit as well, but they also lose areas.
Yeah, and since the Russians are the aggressor, they're not defending their homeland.
No.
I mean, they are, in a sense, the British redcoats, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so it becomes demoralizing,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And
Apart from the fact that they have these meat grinder tactics.
And one thing that's interesting as well is people often speculate about the Ukrainian morale, especially on the front lines. And so I was recently speaking with two different folks, one Ukrainian, one American, who were on the front lines. And they said their morale is actually pretty good. They're cold. They're angry. They want to rotate home. They want to be with their families, but they know what they're defending. They follow the diplomatic talk a little bit, but they're all clear-eyed. They don't trust anything Russia says. They see themselves as the best defense of their country until, they're in, a lasting ceasefire that's being monitored, or they're in NATO, or some, peace comes, but they're not giving up, and their morale stands pretty strong, is what I'm hearing.
Now, final question. Mm-hmm. Since this war will come to an end at some point, the other thing that was talked about a lot when I was there is the post-war scenario, and people are trying to plan. Mm-hmm. One thing that's very important for Ukraine is to try and lure back the millions of people who have fled to Poland, Germany. And obviously, to some extent, those countries are eager to have them return to Ukraine as well. Mm-hmm. So I think the Poles have prospered from the presence of Ukrainians economically. Mm-hmm. How do you see the post-war future of Ukraine? Do you think, given the kind of entrepreneurial dynamism that we've already seen during the war, does that bode well for the future of Ukraine?
I think so. I think a lot of it depends on what the end of the war looks like, and that's what Ukrainians are saying too, and Europeans. If you want people to return, they need to feel that they're returning to a stable situation that won't change with Russia invading in 2 years, especially if they have kids and they're bringing their kids back. If you have teenagers who are going to be of army age, if you're trying to have a business, so that needs some real version of security that they feel.
And that's a very important point, because that's why you can't have these meaningless negotiations, right? You need some kind of security guarantees that actually guarantee something and aren't just paper promises.
Yeah. And I mean, economically, there's a lot of opportunity in Ukraine. There's a EU path for Ukraine. I am not going to speculate on timing, but there's a lot that the Ukrainians can contribute, and there's a lot that businesses that go into Ukraine can get out of being in Ukraine before they get into the EU. So that's something that others are looking at too. But there's also the physical reconstruction, the rebuilding their communities that have been entirely destroyed. We see the energy infrastructure being hit constantly. So that'll have to be looked at. So it'll depend on where people are from too. People that are from Kyiv, more likely to go back than if you're from, obviously, Mariupol. But again, people didn't want to leave Ukraine in many ways. So there is this strong sense of identity and patriotism that I think many will want to go back. But, it's now been a couple of years. So the more settled they are, the harder it is. So they need to feel like they're going back for the long term rather than leave somewhere, you've been in, let's say, Prague for 3 years. You don't want to go back to Ukraine for 6 months. But I think a lot of families want to reunite. Elderly family members are still in Ukraine. I've heard from others, my grandparents are getting older and they just really want to be in Ukraine. They're more comfortable in Ukraine. That's where their home is.
Shelby, thank you.
Thank you.